Hello everyone and welcome to day 29 of INKtoberfest. I hope you've been having a lot of fun with this and have learned a lot. My name is Kassi and today we are going to be talking about the Maker Forte Color Hive Snow Flurries Re-Inker. It's a mouthful, but it is a handy little ink to have. It coordinates with the Snow Flurries ink pad. I would suggest getting a re-inker for your ink pads if that's possible. It will really extend the life of your ink pad. Essentially, when your ink pad runs dry, you can add some ink from your re-inker. Because this is a pigment ink, I like to shake it first, and then you squeeze while rubbing it into the foam pad. Use the nib of your bottle to really push it into the pad. And that's really all there is to it. However, I always like to find other ways to use products that I already have in my craft room. So once you have purchased this to go with your ink pad, what else can you do with it? Let's start by going quickly over what this actually is. Now this is a pigment ink, which is different from the rest of the Color Hive line, which is dye inks. And this means that they will have slightly different properties. So let's start by looking at what the inks actually look like. This is the Color Hive Vegas Strip Dye Ink, and you can see when I squeeze it out of the bottle, it's very liquid. You can see how easily it moves around in my little cup. The Snow Flurries Pigment Re-Inker is a lot thicker. It's a lot harder to squeeze out of the bottle, and you can see it kind of glooping down a little bit more. It's very sticky. It's more the consistency of honey. Besides having different consistencies, they're also going to act differently on paper. So let's move this tray out of the way and take a look at what they do on paper. I'm going to grab a sheet of watercolor paper for this, and I'm going to draw a line with a Sharpie. This will let us test the opacity of each of the inks. So let's start with the Vegas strip, and I'm just going to pick up some of the ink and paint it right over that black line. And I am going as dark as I can with this ink, straight from that ink puddle. Now when I get this up close, you can see that you can clearly see the black line. Dye inks are transparent. You can see through them. Now when we do the same thing with our Snow Flurries, this is a pigment ink, and when I paint it over that black line, you can see that it covers that black line. So the pigment ink is opaque. Why does that matter? Well, you see the bigger difference when you try and paint on dark paper. So let's pull out a piece of Maker Forte's Chip Off the Block craft paper. And let's just do a swatch of the white. And you can see that it very clearly shows up. Let's take a look at what happens when we swatch with our blue ink. You can see the blue ink, but it's very dark and muted and a little bit muddy. Compare what it looks like on the brown paper to the blue swatch above it. Knowing this, we can have some fun by mixing the two colors together. Now you can do this with any of your inks, but because I already have some blue out, I'm just going to use that. So I'm just going to put some blue on my palette, then mix in some of my white ink. When you add white to a color, it will lighten the tone, but it will also make our blue ink opaque. So now, when I paint it over my black line, it covers the black line, just like the white did. And when I paint it onto my craft paper, look how vibrant it is. And you can do this same process with all of your Color Hive re-inkers. So you can take your entire collection of re-inkers, and by adding one color, the white, you can now have pastels as well as opaques in all of your colors. So it really expands your palette. So let's take a look at some of the variations that we can get using a different color. I've grabbed the Flamingo, and I'm just going to put some on my palette. By changing how much white we add to the color, we also change the characteristics, so we can get a lot of variation. So for this one, I'm using just a little bit of white in with my pink, and I'm going to swatch it out. You can see it's fairly dark pink still, and it is also fairly dark on the brown paper. This is because I didn't add very much white to it. Let me swatch it straight from the bottle just so that you can see. It's a little bit brighter straight from the bottle, and the one that we added a little bit of white to, it has a slightly chalky finish to it. So again, you can see what it looks like on that brown paper. Now let's go ahead and add more of the white in there. And you can see that it's really making this a much lighter pink. And it also makes it more vivid on the brown paper. So the more white you add, the brighter it will be on your brown paper, but it will also be more pastel. So you can get a lot of variations from one ink color and your white just by changing the ratios. As fun as it is to just play with colors, let's go ahead and clear this off and make a few simple projects so that you can see how you can apply your understanding of the properties of the ink in your daily crafting. Okay, I put down a nonstick craft sheet just to protect my work surface, and I'm going to be working on some tags cut from chip off the block craft paper. Let's start really easy. You just need a colored ink and your Snow Flurries ink. I'm using telephone box for my color, but you could use whatever color you want. Go ahead and make a little puddle on your palette of your colored ink, as well as of your white pigment ink. And then you'll want to grab a flat paintbrush. We're going to start with a slightly damp brush, so go ahead and dip that brush in some water. Then you're going to dip one corner of your brush in your colored ink and the opposite corner in your white ink. So you're going to have two different colors on your brush, and when you brush them against your surface, those two colors will blend in the middle. So I'm just going to drag this across the bottom of my tag. If you're having a hard time getting it to glide across the paper, add just a tiny bit more water. For our second pass, you can choose if you want to keep the brush going the same direction or if you want to flip it. I like to flip mine so that I have my white kind of going over top of the white that I already laid down. That's just my personal preference, and you can go ahead and try it both ways and see which way you like. And you can just continue building your stripe pattern as far up your tag as you want. And here our background is finished. Now you can go ahead and stamp on this or write a little message, whatever you want to do, but this is what it looks like when you're done. I love the way that the red and the white bleed together, and the different variances in the opacity really make the colors pop. For our second tag, let's go ahead and try painting a scene on our craft paper. I'm going to go ahead and create a background using the Vegas strip, just like I used earlier. So I already have some in there, but I am going to get a little bit more of the Snow Flurries. I'm going to continue using that flat brush that I used earlier, and I'm going to mix in a fair amount of white to my blue. Remember that the more white you add, the lighter the color will be and the more opaque it will be. Because I'm using both the dye and the pigment ink straight from the bottle, they're very concentrated. So sometimes you may want to add in a little bit of water. I'm just adding a drop of water into there just to help loosen up the color and help it to move better on the palette. When you're happy with your color, go ahead and paint a loose, messy square on your tag. If you want really nice squared off edges, you could mask your edges, but I am okay with them just being loose and a little bit messy. Once you have your background done, go ahead and let that dry completely. Now I'm switching over to a round brush and we're going to paint a snowman. Load up your brush with the white ink and then just draw a rough circle. It does not have to be perfect. Snowmen usually aren't exactly perfect. They're a little bit lumpy and lopsided. On top of your bottom circle, do a slightly smaller circle. Once you have your snowman, you can add in a little bit of white on the ground to show the snow. And I'm just scribbling some lines on there, leaving a little bit of that blue as shadow, but just keeping it very loose. And again, we're going to let this dry. After it is dried, you might find that the white doesn't look quite so bright. So you can go ahead and add a second layer of white ink over top of the first. What's happened is the moisture from your white ink has reactivated the blue in the first layer and soaked it up a little bit. Adding a second layer will help brighten your whites. While working on my second layer, I decided my snowman needed a third level. You can keep your snowman as a 2-ball snowman, or you can add a third ball for his head like I did. Now you have to let this layer dry too. If you want to speed that up, you can use a heat gun. I like to heat from both the top and the bottom to avoid warping. Now it's time to add some details to our snowman. Now, something you need to realize when you're working with pigment and dye inks together is that the opacity of the pigment ink is always going to overpower the transparency of the dye ink. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at our swatches, and I'm just going to grab the red Leicester, and this is a lovely orange color. Now, if I take that ink right out of the bottle and I put it over my white swatch here, it goes on transparent, but as it sits there, it starts to reactivate the pigment ink underneath and it starts turning cloudy. And that is going to happen no matter what. So if you are going to paint over a pigment ink background, I suggest you just mix more pigment ink into all of the colors you add on top of it and just stay within that same medium because it's all going to turn that way anyway. And if you mix it on your palette, you have more control over what color you're putting down. So I'm going to mix some of the red Leicester in with my white pigment ink to create an orange for my carrot nose. And the carrot nose is pretty much just a long, skinny triangle. I want to add a little bit of dimension to my snowman, so I'm going to add some Fog Re-Inker to my blue and white mix that I did for my background. I'm also going to add in a little bit more blue to make it a darker color. I'm then going to add in a very simple C-shaped shadow on the back edge of each one of those snowballs. Now let's add some buttons. I already have some telephone box on my palette, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. So I'm mixing that in with some white, and I'm just going to do some little dots down his front. And again, we have to let this dry. One thing that I've noticed happens when I do this technique is all of my colors seem to blur together because there's not a lot of contrast. So to help give it more definition, I'm just taking a black pen and I'm going to go ahead and outline my image. I do this after I've colored because if you paint over a black line with your opaque ink, it's going to cover your black line. Doing it last ensures that the black line stays black. If you had stamped an image, then you could go ahead and retrace your lines with a black pen after coloring it to ensure you have a good solid black line. I found that this ink kind of jammed up my pen a little bit, so I just had to scribble it off on some scratch paper to get it running again. While I'm doing my outline, I'm also going to add in some eyes and some branches for his arms. You can leave your tag just like this, or if you want to, you can add a border. This is a really fun way to add a colorful scene to a dark background. I love the pale blue and the white against the craft. I think it's gorgeous. For our third tag, why don't we paint a scene without painting a background first? I'm using the Caldwell green and I'm going to put that on my palette. This time I am not going to mix any white with it. I'm going to use it as a dye ink. I'm using a small round brush and I'm going to paint in some pine trees. Now these are really simple. Just start with a basic triangle shape and some scribbles. I'm not trying to fill in the entire shape. I'm letting some light shine through the background. Let's go ahead and add a couple more trees in. To create the snowy ground, I'm going to use some more white ink. So I've refilled my little puddle and I'm just going to scribble on some basic ground. I'm not trying to cover the entire thing. I just want to give the highlights of the snow. You can add a little bit more water if it's not sliding across the page nicely. Because there's no layer of ink behind this to reactivate, you won't have to worry about this snow picking up any color. Now let's add some snow to our trees. Start by adding some to the top of the tree and then the edges of each one of the branches. I'm just kind of dabbing it on. The snow on the trees, because it is over top of your dye ink, it could pick up some of that color. So you may need to do 2 layers of snow on the trees. Once that's dry, we can do my favorite thing to do with this re-inker, and that is to splatter. All I'm doing is adding a little bit of water to my re-inker. So I'm making it a little bit juicier, and I'm picking that up on my brush, and I'm just going to hold my brush over my project and tap it. You can get different size splatters by changing what size brush you have and how much water you have in your re-inker. I love these tiny little splatters that are perfect for snowflakes or for a starry sky. White splatters are a very fun and popular thing to add to a lot of different types of projects, and the Snow Flurries Re-Inker is a great way to get those splatters. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope it inspired you to pull out your Snow Flurries Re-Inker and have some fun with it. I hope you will join us tomorrow for more Inktoberfest fun, and have a wonderfully creative day.